Hello, everyone. My name is Jacob Kabala. I'm on the Faculty of History and Digital Studies at Davidson College. And it is my pleasure tonight to moderate tonight's installment of our social distancing lecture series. Every Wednesday from now until May 6th, a member of our history department will moderate a conversation with a scholar whose research about the human experiences of disease and recovery in the past might help put our own experiences of pandemic in context. You can see the rest of the lineup on the calendar at the bottom of the college's homepage, www.davidson.edu. Before we begin tonight's conversation, I would like to thank several staff members at Davidson who have worked really hard to make this possible. Ebony Stubbs, Amy Elkins, Daniel Linz, Adele Patton, Winnie Newton, and everyone at College Communications. A big thank you. And I'd also like to thank my colleague, Rose Stremlau, for conceiving and organizing this lecture series. A bit of housekeeping. Our speaker tonight will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we will have time for questions. At any point during the event, you can send questions to us using YouTube live chat. If you feel comfortable doing so, please let us know your name, where you are, and if you are a student, faculty member, staff member, alum, or a community member. We'd love to know who is participating. So it is a real pleasure for me now to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Kyle Harper is Professor of Classics and Letters and Senior Vice President and Provost at the University of Oklahoma. He is a specialist in the history of the Roman and late ancient world and has written 3 books and a number of articles on various aspects of antiquity and early Christianity. His first book, published by Cambridge in 2011, was entitled Slavery in the Late Roman World, AD 275 to 425. His second book appeared in 2013 with Harvard University Press and was entitled From Shame to Sin, The Christian Transformation of Sexual Morality. Most recently, his third book came out with Princeton University Press in 2017, entitled The Fate of Rome, Climate, Disease, and the End of an Empire. Dr. Harper's talk tonight will look forward to his current book project, which explores the history of infectious disease more generally. Kyle, it's terrific to have you. Welcome, and please take it away.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Kuba, for connecting me to this. And I want to thank Rose for inviting me and for the whole Davidson team for their work in putting this together. So it's really a privilege to be a part of this great speaker series, and thank you to all of you who are listening. I admit it's a little bit strange to be talking into a camera without being able to see you or your reactions, but I'm very excited to do it. I put on a tie for the first time in over a month, and surprisingly, it felt great to have an excuse to put on a tie and to have a little sense of some normalcy in giving an academic lecture. So I'm excited to get to talk about it. As Kuba mentioned, I have 2 roles. I have an administrative role at my university at Oklahoma and a scholarly role. I'm a historian who's become an economic historian working on infectious diseases. And usually those are pretty separate parts of my day. And it's been strange, to say the least, over the last few months, like George Costanza, if you remember in Seinfeld, when his worlds collide, to watch my pandemic disease world collide, which is usually my sort of abstract historical part of my life, and the more day-to-day administrative part of life collide. This has been really an extraordinary few months to live through and witness something that's clearly historic. And I think sort of like the Twin Towers falling or the Berlin Wall falling, there's a sense that we're living through history. And so it's only natural that historians want to engage and have maybe some perspective to bring, although I will say, I find myself repeatedly saying that being an expert on Roman infectious disease turns out to be of absolutely no practical use in living through or trying to help be an administrator through a pandemic. Nonetheless, we look to history for perspective. And as a historian, I think of myself as an economic historian who has increasingly gotten interested in the environment, and particularly in the history of infectious diseases. And partly that's because I was very lucky when I was a graduate student to have wonderful mentors who encouraged interdisciplinary work and encouraged kind of disrespect for traditional boundaries of what history means. But I've also, as an economic historian, come to believe that diseases broadly and epidemic events specifically are overrated. They've been, and at the same time, they're something that we have increasing knowledge about. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So it's kind of through those influences that I ended up getting interested in the history of infectious disease and epidemic diseases. And I think for a Roman historian, particularly somebody who works on the period that interests me, which is really the high to late Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire reaches its largest territorial extent, its greatest population extent, probably its greatest levels of economic prosperity in the middle of the 2nd century of the Common Era. And that's sort of the beginning of the period that I mostly concentrate on. And the next several centuries are what we traditionally call the later Roman Empire and late antiquity. And for somebody who studies that period, I think to not be interested in infectious disease would be to be missing out on one of the really important phenomena for the period that we study. So I think that epidemic diseases are tremendously important. They're one of the main elements that drive change in this period. But I also think that when you step back, that this period is actually important in the history of infectious disease. So if you're interested more broadly in questions about human social development, and you're interested in questions about the history of human disease, this period, say the 2nd to the 7th centuries of the Common Era, turns out to be a really interesting period biologically, so to speak. And so as Kuba mentioned in my last book, focus on a series of what are true pandemics that strike the Roman Empire. One in the 2nd century that is known as the Antonine Plague, and I'll talk about it just a little bit. And then the other two I won't focus on as much in the interest of trying to move on, but I'm happy to talk about it if there are questions. A second pandemic that strikes in the middle of the 3rd century, known as the Plague of Cyprian, that is coincident with a period of extraordinary crisis and challenge for the Roman Empire. And we have basically no idea what the pathogen that caused that pandemic was. And then last and third, and I think the most significant of all, a pandemic that begins in the 6th century in the period of the Emperor Justinian in 541, and that has an initial outbreak that we now know covers at least 3 continents and reaches far and wide, and is only the first outbreak in what will be 2 centuries of repeated episodes of bubonic plague. And we now know, thanks to genetic evidence, beyond any doubt, that the biological cause of this event is the bacterium known as Yersinia pestis. And so this is called properly the first plague pandemic. And in some ways, it's a prelude or a foreshadowing of the late medieval second pandemic that starts with the Black Death. So Roman history over this period experiences these giant pandemic events. And let me define pandemic, because that's an important word that we use to help categorize different kinds of disease events. And I think we can best do so by putting it alongside some comparable words. When we talk about a disease being endemic, that means that it's permanently established in a population. So measles might be endemic in a particular place. And it doesn't say anything necessarily about the level of prevalence or change over time. It just means that the disease is established in that particular population. Then when we talk about the incidence of a disease changing over time, we'll use the word epidemic. And that simply means something like a disease outbreak, a sharp spike in the prevalence of a particular infectious disease. An epidemic doesn't say very much about the spatial dimensions of a disease event. And so when we talk about a pandemic, we're talking about an epidemic or some kind of disease episode that covers a large territory, that it covers multiple regions, or even more broadly, multiple continents. So the Roman Empire experiences these at least 3 pandemics. And they're significant because this isn't necessarily always the historical case. And so I know the example of Rome best, and in the entire source base that we have for the centuries leading down to the 2nd century pandemic that we call the Antonine Plague, there are no historically attested pandemic events. So this is something that interrupts Roman history, that is new. And there's quite a lot we can say about this pandemic event in the 2nd century. We don't know for certain what its biological cause was, although most historians who've worked on it have speculated that it was caused by the smallpox virus. I think that's a reasonable hypothesis. There are some reasons to believe that that might be true. There are some complexities around the question and the evidence for it. Unfortunately, the only evidence that we have to help us decide that are the written sources, the literary evidence, and particularly the 2nd century doctor who wrote in Greek and was one of the major medical figures of antiquity named Galen, who gives us several descriptions of the symptoms of the disease and describes a black pustular rash that shed over the entire body and did so quite slowly. And he describes a highly lethal disease, highly contagious disease. We can at least infer that from the nature of its movements. So it's usually argued that this is smallpox. It's a reasonable position. And if so, I think we could think of this episode as the emergence of a new disease. The smallpox virus, we now know, is a relatively young pathogen that evolved at some point in the recent past from an animal reservoir. The closest known relative of the smallpox virus is a virus that infects a kind of rodent, a gerbil that only lives in the savanna of Africa and may or may not have been the immediate ancestral host of the pathogen that turned into smallpox. But smallpox evolved into a human disease. And if so, if this was smallpox, came into the Roman Empire, probably over trading networks that connected the Romans, we know, to the world beyond the Roman Empire. So we know the Roman Empire was highly connected across the Sahara Desert, along the Red Sea, via shipping with the Indian Ocean world, and then of course overland across the Silk Roads that ran through Mesopotamia and connected Rome with the East. So the Roman Empire had plenty of opportunity to import an infectious disease from the outside. Now, historians who have worked on this from an economic perspective often construe it as what they call an exogenous event. And that's an interesting word when economic historians use it, because it means that it comes from nowhere, that it comes somehow from outside the system, that we didn't see this kind of event coming. And I think that to a large extent, that's accurate. The Roman Empire was struck from without by an epidemic event that didn't have necessarily internal causes. We don't think that the Roman population was overrunning its carrying capacity or the limits. In fact, I did a detailed study of real wages in the Roman Empire, and the ordinary unskilled laborers' wages were going up right down to the period of the Antonine Plague. But that doesn't mean, just because it's exogenous and isn't caused by overpopulation, doesn't mean that that this is a totally inexplicable event. And I think one way to approach this is to think of the Roman Empire in ecological terms. The Roman Empire was highly urbanized. So just to take the signal example, the city of Rome itself was probably the first human settlement to reach 1 million people. And it was only one of thousands of cities of some size that represented a great surge of urbanization relative to the periods that came before it. It was a highly interconnected society, both internally within the Roman Empire around the Mediterranean. Romans are famous for building roads, but also the Roman shipping network was extraordinarily thickly connected across the Mediterranean. And then, as I mentioned, highly connected with the world beyond the Roman Empire. You can think of the Roman period as a kind of early phase in the long history of globalization. And just to kind of provide a symbolic point to hang that on, it's probably during the Roman Empire that China becomes aware of the existence of Rome, and mutually Rome becomes aware of China. So this is a time period of global connectivity. And it's also a time period of global population growth. The Roman Empire probably achieves a population of 75 million, and the total number of humans during this period probably reaches on the order of 300 million. So all of these are ingredients that create the ecological platform for the emergence of a disease event. So that's the kind of question and problem that I've worked on up to now. But I'm now interested in kind of zooming out, because I think you can study these disease events that strike, say, the Roman Empire, and it still doesn't necessarily fully answer the question of why did this happen? I always think that's the best question that historians can ask. Why did the Roman Empire suffer from these large-scale pandemic events? And another way to put it is that I'm very interested in the big or deep patterns of human history, and particularly infectious disease. And so I want to try and frame some ways to think about the big patterns of human infectious diseases. And I'll frame it in terms of patterns rather than, I think, examples or lessons or parallels. I'm getting asked every day about parallels. What are the parallels with the COVID pandemic and Roman history? I think that's a very hard question to answer scientifically, but I think it's a good question, and I like its motivation. But I think the question we can rather ask is, how can we understand the patterns of historical disease emergence? And disease emergence, the arrival of new diseases, is always, I think, a mixture of structure and chance. That is, that there are structural reasons why diseases emerge and when they emerge and where they emerge. And there's always a role of random chance. And the reasons for that, I think, have to do with the two key terms if we want to understand the history of disease, and that's ecology and evolution. So the way to understand the history of infectious diseases, like those that struck the Roman Empire, as well as diseases like SARS coronavirus 2, pathogens like SARS coronavirus 2, are ecology and evolution. So ecology is to the whole system of interrelationship between life and the search for energy. And I'll talk a little bit about how humans construct ecologies, but the way that humans transform the planet in search of energy and the way that our environments create the context for the evolution of diseases is one of the most important ways to understand why particular diseases emerge and when they emerge. And secondly is evolution. That's the fundamental principle of all biology, and it certainly has to be the central principle in trying to understand diseases historically. Whether it's SARS coronavirus 2, whether it's smallpox, whether it's the malaria protozoan or the measles virus, the only thing that explains how they came to be is evolution, the blind process of genetic adaptation. So SARS coronavirus 2 or smallpox virus is trying to do the exact same thing that every other species on the planet is doing, which is simply to reproduce their genomes. And I think if we can come at the question this way, then it helps us combine history and biology. And that's how I understand what I'm trying to do, is to work at the frontiers between history and biology, and particularly deep history. So I'm very interested in big time scales and in seeing things in the broadest possible perspective. That's only one way of doing history. I think there are lots of valid ways of doing history that are complementary. It's important to focus on the particular, but it's also important to focus on the broad patterns. And as we do so, as we bring history and biology closer together, we live at a really extraordinary time when I think historians can talk to and work with and collaborate with biologists more than ever before, because biology is in many ways a very historical discipline. Evolution is a historical phenomenon. And maybe most importantly, genomes are historical archives. So the genome of any given species on the planet carries around in it tremendous historical evidence. And that's true not just of human genomes, but also of the genomes of microscopic organisms like viruses and bacteria. And the kind of data that we now have as historians about the history of life on this planet, including the history of the microbial pathogens that have infected our species, is, I think, one of the most exciting frontiers of new knowledge. So I'm trying to understand human history as the story of how a primate evolved that ultimately transformed the ecology of planet Earth, that domesticated plants and animals, that built cities, that built transportation technologies, that connected populations into ever larger unified systems, and how that changing ecology, the way that we've extracted energy and the nature of our lives, creates the evolutionary conditions for pathogens to emerge, evolve, and so on. And one of I think the main lessons of looking at history this way is simply to quote the profound American rock band, The Doors, people are strange. Human beings are really strange. And I don't just mean that if you've been watching Tiger King, which is certainly a show that coincided with the quarantine and puts Oklahoma in a very interesting light. Not just people are strange in that sense, but biologically, our species is extraordinary in the ecological systems that we've constructed and the pathogens that result from that. Humans have an extraordinarily weird number of pathogens, and they're extraordinarily virulent. So we have an unusual number of infectious diseases, and they're unusually focused on us, specialized in the infection of us. And the reason is because we're such a good host. So if you look at our closest relative, the chimpanzee, it has, relative to humans, a tiny number of pathogens. Many of them are worms or helminths. Many of them are protozoa, which we also have helminth and protozoal parasites. But we also have a huge number of bacteria and viruses that have evolved to adapt to us because we're such appealing hosts. All they want to do is reproduce their genes. And to do so, they need either chemical energy or the nutrients that we carry around in our bodies. Or if they're viruses, they simply want to hijack the replication machinery inside of our cells. And the fact that there are 8 billion of us makes us tremendously appealing. There are only a few 100,000 chimpanzees, and they're geographically very limited. They live in relatively small bands. Humans have 8 billion. We live in megacities. We're hugely interconnected. And so we are the most appealing mammalian host on planet Earth. So it's only to be expected that we've provoked the evolution of an unusual number of highly specialized pathogens. So think about the array of diseases that human beings have. Let me give you 3 quick examples that just kind of illustrate the variety and nature of some of our pathogens. Think about one bacterium, one protozoan, and one virus. These are very different taxa or different evolutionary groups, but they share the basic fact that they are the biological causes of different human infectious diseases. So take, for example, bacteria. Bacteria cause everything from plague to leprosy to tuberculosis, but they also cause diseases like typhoid fever. Typhoid fever is an amazing disease that has been dramatically reduced in the developed world. It's still a major cause of morbidity and mortality in underdeveloped societies, but it's a bacterium that passes through the fecal oral route. So it's passed out in fecal matter, and then it has to arrive in the next host through dirty fingers or contaminated water, or through flies, which often carry the typhoid fever bacterium. It was a major cause of death throughout human history. And we've come to learn really what an extraordinary being it is. It's a bacterium, or I should say, it's actually 5 different strains of bacteria or lineages of bacteria within the species Salmonella enterica. So when you get salmonella food poisoning, which is maybe a little more familiar to us, it's actually a very close relative of the same bacterium, Salmonella enterica, that causes typhoid fever, which is a horrific disease that invades the small intestine but manages to escape our immune walls in the small intestine to diffuse throughout the entire body, causing a tremendously long, painful, excruciating kind of sickness. Typhoid fever is probably one of the major killers of humans, but it's not a particularly ancient disease. And particularly some of the strains of typhoid fever we know only evolved in the last 10,000 years. That's interesting because that's the period of agriculture. And humans, when they start domesticating plants and animals, they start living in sedentary societies, create a completely new ecology. And part of that ecology is frankly waste. Human beings live in probably the most extraordinary waste environments, surrounded permanently by their own filth, but also the filth of their domesticated animals. And typhoid fever is a set of strains of bacteria that have adapted to that. So most strains of Salmonella enterica cannot cause typhoid fever, but the ones that can have evolved. And we're now able to follow this precise molecular changes that allowed those adaptations. In fact, what they do is they lose genes because they don't have to be able to invade every kind of intestine that they might meet. They don't have to be Swiss Army knives, so to speak. They're laser focused on invading the human small intestine. So it's a pathogen whose evolution we drove by creating particular kinds of environments, particular kinds of ecologies. And it was one of the great killers until the modern period. In developed societies, it is eradicated relatively quickly. in the early 20th century by the miracle of chlorination. So if you take water and you chlorinate it or chloraminate it, if you treat it, then you have relatively little fear of dying of typhoid. But it's one of the truly extraordinary success stories in the history of human health that we're able to take a drink of water and not have the least fear of contracting typhoid fever. It's also a privilege of living in the developed world that's not pathogen. Really quickly, one that was also a major killer in the Roman Empire, and in this case, is a single-cell organism, a protozoan called malaria. Plasmodium, in this case, falciparum, is one of at least 4 species of the single-cell parasite that is capable of causing human disease. And there's 2 major causes of malarial disease in humans. One is Plasmodium vivax. It's a pathogen that is more geographically widespread. It was once prevalent across much of even Europe and the United States because it's able to survive in colder climates. And Plasmodium falciparum is another species of malarial parasite that is more associated with tropical regions. It's not able to survive over cold winters. And these are some of the most devastating pathogens throughout human history. And we know that they were prevalent in the Roman Empire and were a major cause of human disease in the Roman Empire, both species, Plasmodium vivax and Plasmodium falciparum. What I want to highlight about this extraordinary pathogen is that it's vector-borne, and that means that it relies on a transport mechanism, a biting insect, in this case, particular species of mosquitoes, members of a very specific genus of mosquitoes, the Anopheles mosquitoes. And its geographical dispersion is entirely dependent on the geography of these insect vectors. Malaria falciparum is a really an evolutionary kind of monster. In fact, it too evolved within the last 10,000 years and is probably a product of the intensification of agriculture in West or West Central Africa. We know that it evolved from a primate disease. It was probably an ape disease that adapted to human beings as human populations grew, as agriculture spread, and as populations became more dense. One of the really extraordinary features of Plasmodium falciparum is that it's so virulent that it probably required large populations of humans to avoid extinction. So it's in some sense an enemy that we've again helped to create by the particular environments and ecologies that we've created. Third, I just want to mention a viral disease because I think it provides another kind of perspective. So viruses it's questionable whether or not they're alive or not. They're simply genetic material inside a protein coat that tries to hijack the host cell's replication machinery in order to reproduce itself. And humans have an unusual number of viruses that are specialized in the adaptation of us, including viruses like the causative agent of the measles. Measles is a terrible disease. It's a respiratory virus that's one of the most contagious human diseases known. It's very dangerous infection. And we don't know very much about its early history. This is another area where the genetic evidence is starting to revolutionize what we know. I used to not believe that the measles virus existed in the Roman Empire, but increasingly I think we have to have an open mind about it, as new molecular clock work is starting to show that the measles virus is probably about 2,000 years old. So it may or may not have existed in the Roman Empire. This is genetic evidence rather than literary evidence that may tell us about the evolution of this pathogen. But what we can say is that measles couldn't have evolved much more than about 2,000 years ago because it is so contagious that it requires enormous populations in order to avoid extinction. Measles has what's called a critical population threshold of about 250,000. So if there's not a dense urban settlement of about 250,000 people, then measles virus will burn through the population so quickly, either killing its victims or leaving them with immunity, that it has no more new hosts. So a virus like measles is also, in that sense, a pathogen that has evolved in recent history because of the ecologies that we've created, namely large cities with huge numbers of human individuals who are potentially susceptible hosts. So think of the differences between these kinds of human pathogens. One's a virus, one's a bacterium, one's a protozoan. They have very different modes of transmission. In fact, they represent three of the main modes of transmission. Measles is a respiratory virus. Malaria is a vector-borne disease. Typhoid fever is caused by a fecal-oral pathogen. And they have very different geographies. Typhoid and measles are relatively indiscriminate in their geography, whereas malaria is highly particular about its geographical preferences. So there are tremendous differences, but I think what's even more impressive are the kind of similarities between these diseases. And maybe most notably of all, they are all human specialists. These are all virulent diseases that have evolved to be highly specialized in doing one thing, which is either stealing energy and nutrients or stealing the machinery of cell replication from us because we're such attractive hosts. These all came from animal origins. Typhoid fever is probably a generalist species that infects a wide variety of animals. Malaria is probably a primate pathogen that adapts to humans. Measles is very interesting because its most immediate relative is probably a cattle virus known as rinderpest virus. But even that, in a sense, is probably partly a human creation and ancestral to the rinderpest virus. It is probably a rodent virus. So animal reservoirs are the ultimate origin, evolutionary origins of pathogens like this. But as humans change the environment, as we intrude on natural systems, as we grow in our population, and as we're more interconnected between different societies, it creates a platform for the evolution of diseases. So that's, I think, how we can explain what happens in the Roman Empire and situate it in terms of a bigger historical pattern of the emergence of diseases. And so people obviously ask, well, what does that have to tell us? How does that provide context or pattern for the pandemic that we're living through? And I think in some ways it does, but I think it's important to see the modern period not in terms of things just getting better or just getting worse, but I think what's really distinctive about human history over the last several thousand years that accelerates over the last 100 years is that in some ways it gets better and worse at the same time. And the way to understand our particular moment is to appreciate that we live in a world where most infectious diseases are under control. This is a hallmark of the modern world, is that if you live in a developed society, most days you don't even think about the threat of infectious disease. Most people die of chronic diseases, cardiovascular disorders, cancers, but not infectious diseases. And that separates us from most humans who've ever lived. It's only around 1900 in the United States that chronic and cardiovascular and cancer pass infectious causes as the leading cause of death for most of the population. So this is very recent that we've controlled infectious diseases through a variety of mechanisms, through environmental controls, public health, sanitation, hygiene, biomedicine, vaccines, chemical control of insect vectors, and so on, that infectious diseases have been controlled, but they can't be conquered. And in some ways, the best way to think of the last 100 years might be to imagine it as a period of extraordinary countervailing pressures when we've created more incentive than ever. Human populations are now over 7.5 billion. We're more interconnected than ever. And the evolutionary opportunity for pathogens has never been greater. But we also have systems of public health and biomedicine that provide tremendous protection for us. So the COVID-19 pandemic and SARS coronavirus 2, its causative agent, in a sense represent a virus that found a way to exploit vulnerabilities, because there are vulnerabilities in our control of infectious diseases. For one thing, they're very globally incomplete, and there's enormous global inequity in the control of infectious diseases, and that's a threat to people everywhere. Another is the continued evolution of diseases, and particularly things like antibiotic resistance that represent a major threat to our control of infectious diseases. And all along, I think the best public health experts have warned that that we would be tremendously exposed to a highly contagious respiratory virus, that the nature of our globally interconnected society and the fact that viruses are relatively difficult to treat therapeutically and are best we're best protected against them by vaccines, meant that responding after the fact to the emergence of a new and highly contagious respiratory virus that would spread directly between humans before we could establish a vaccine was a kind of vulnerability. And these events are always the outcome of structure and chance. There's a randomness to the fact that it was this particular virus that evolved in central China at this particular moment. But I think we could also structurally have foreseen that this was a vulnerability. So there's tremendous differences, but also some. This is a product of globalization, growth of human intrusion in natural systems. So I think the best way to see this is in terms of these very deep patterns in which humans create incentive for pathogens to evolve, but also we've developed tremendous forms of control over infectious diseases that nevertheless remain incomplete and imperfect, leaving us vulnerable to evolution, which never stops. So even today, the best way to understand our present predicament is to put it in terms of ecology and evolution. And I think we can understand ecology and evolution best from a deep historical perspective that understands the 20th century, as different as it is, as part of a long continuum of a human story in which our species has taken over the planet and driven the evolution of microbes of all different taxa and incentivized the benefits that they can receive by learning how to exploit us. So I'll stop there and look forward to questions about the Roman Empire or ways we might think about the ecology and evolution of infectious diseases from a historical perspective. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Kyle. I'll give you a thumbs up instead of the hand clap. That was terrific. For all of you listening, please feel free to write your questions in via the YouTube live chat, and we're keeping track of those, and we'll ask Kyle as many as we can. So why don't I start here with, there's been a couple questions that have been kind of getting at the same thing. And I will one of these was asked by Chris, a Davidson alum from 1995. And a similar question also came from the parent of a student listening. I'll read Chris's question. Did Romans engage in what we would consider to be public health initiatives to prevent or stop the spread of disease? If so, how did the Roman government engage in intentional disease prevention and suppression?
What a great question. And I'll say that a year or two ago, I was an outside reader on a graduate dissertation at Columbia by a young scholar in Carolyn Wazer, who wrote about just this very question. So a lot of what I would say is indebted to her great work and that thesis on this question that tried to think through that very question. And I think at a high level, the answer is that the Romans didn't have necessarily that category, although they could think in terms of the health of the people, and they would think of the salus populi, and you would see coinage that might talk about the health or well-being, the flourishing of the people. But there wasn't a category that maps perfectly onto our modern concept of public health. I think that if we're looking for public health in the Roman Empire, we're probably looking mostly for urban infrastructure, and urban infrastructure that was often sort of focused on hygiene and sanitation, but obviously without an understanding of the nature of infectious disease. The Romans don't have germ theory, and these were mostly interested in maintaining a kind of clean environment in the city. And so you can think of the aqueducts bringing fresh water to the city, which were obviously an important public good in the Roman world. And so there's maybe a rudimentary kind of urban hygiene before the name of public health. I think some of those institutions are lost in the Middle Ages, or at least the early Middle Ages, and then come back as part of urban infrastructure in the later Middle Ages. There's a paper just last year by a medievalist, Guy Geltner, that talks about this, and it's very helpful in seeing how some of these late medieval cities were also thinking about how do you live in a community and keep it clean and make sure that waste is disposed of. And it often has a lot to do with smell. And if, and you can have worse ways of thinking about cleanliness in an urban setting than to think about how do you control the disposal of bodies that are butchered or human waste. But that's still a long way from what we think of as modern public health. And I think there's still something really important about seeing the kind of social movements in the late 18th and 19th century that are partly spurred by urbanization in the Industrial Revolution and the kind of frankly shock of urbanization without modern public health in the late 18th century that in some ways is actually a setback to human health. Some of the urban environments of the late 18th and early 19th century truly exacerbated things like typhoid fever. And so the response in the late 18th and early 19th century of the kind of sanitarians and what we really think of as the origins of public health, that I think is a really important rupture, and it is something new that's different from anything the Romans had or anything that really existed in the pre-modern period.
Thanks. A brief follow-up to that. A parent of a student asked also about the water delivery and sewage systems. I'm glad you brought that up. Part of that question was also, did the Romans actually make changes to these systems during plague, kind of as a response to these?
That's a great, yeah, I meant to talk about that. So let me be brief about the water and sewage, because I actually, and the historians, there's reasonable debate about this, and there's some smart people who wouldn't agree with what I'm about to say, but I think it's very easy to overestimate the public health benefits of Roman civil engineering. And despite the brilliance of the aqueduct system and some of the sewage systems are really storm drainage and storm control systems. And the Romans, even though they could have connected their privies to the sewers, they don't. They use cesspits and they're gathering waste and selling it. So the Roman city must have been a terribly dirty place. So I'm not actually very optimistic about the kind of urban health in the Roman Empire, despite the aqueducts and despite some sophisticated sewage systems from an engineering perspective. I think they didn't understand infectious disease and were simply overwhelmed by the problem of having 1 million people live in one place. So I'm not actually much of an optimist. Was this useful in epidemics? No. And I think this is really important, that the Romans, they have some concepts of contagion. They don't have really a framework or a theory that can explain contagion very well, I don't think. But they don't develop quarantine. That's very much a late medieval and even early modern development, that there need to be specific kinds of public intervention that break the transmission of diseases between people or communities. So they don't have quarantine, and mostly the public response to infectious disease events, to epidemics, seems to have been religious. So rather than trying quarantine or social distancing, the Romans sacrifice animals to the god Apollo and ask him to stop the pestilence, which didn't seem to have worked. Great.
Here's a question from my colleague, Professor Kane Cheshire from the Classics Department at Davidson. I'm just going to read this out loud. Is Rome's having the first 3 attested pandemics a result of a fuller historical record, unprecedented population size, the degree of connectivity, or some combination of all of it?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'd start by clarifying what I meant, and could have been clear about this, that what's interesting to me as a Roman historian is that where you have a pretty good record from the late Roman Republic, say from 100 BC to the period of the Antonine plagues, 2.5 centuries, where you have a pretty good written record, there's attestations of epidemics, but not anything like the pandemic. I mean, the Antonine plague has so much more evidence and such more geographically widespread evidence than anything that came in the 250 years before that. So I'm using that to say that this was something pretty distinct, but I don't necessarily think that it was the first ever pandemic. And one of the things that there are widespread disease events in earlier Greek history in the 4th century BC. And then beyond the classical Mediterranean, there were probably pandemics. I wish that I knew the Chinese historical record, but from what I can read of it, there do seem to be some pretty widespread pandemic, or at least big epidemic events that are just as early. So I would be cautious in trying to say that these Roman pandemics were the first ever pandemics. But it's hard to point to similar scale disease events that are very well attested. So before that, so part of that may be the historical record, although the prior centuries past are equal, if not even better. So I think that's an important point. But I think if we had a more complete record, and as we bring in more genetic evidence, as you know, the archaeological evidence for bubonic plague is starting to fill in parts of that story that are big gaps in our knowledge and may suggest the incidence of pandemic diseases earlier in human history. But I still think there's something real to this phenomenon. I think that partly it's just human population growth and the interconnection of human populations. The amount of commerce across the Indian Ocean in the Roman period is really extraordinary. So you have the kind of African, Asian, European populations coming together in a way that I think this was in some ways intuited more than a generation ago by William McNeill, whose great book, Plagues and Peoples, is kind of a first attempt to bring this ecological perspective to human history and the history of human disease. And he calls this, he describes this period as the confluence of the disease pools of Eurasia or something like that. And the book's well out of date now, but I think there's still a kind of profound intuition that there is something new. So I would be willing to say that there are probably pandemics before that we just don't know about, but that still there's something going on here as human populations grow and get more interconnected, that we're sort of stoking the fire.
Interesting. Speaking of the record and the Antonine Plague in particular, there's another question from the classics department at Davidson from Professor Gene Newman. Namely, what are the sources for the Antonine Plague? Is it only Galen, or do we have inscriptions as well? And what do they say if we have them?
Yeah, so there are a handful of literary sources besides Galen. Galen's one of the important contemporary witnesses, but Aelius Aristides, the 2nd century Greek orator, was probably a victim of the Antonine Plague. He survived. He was infected. And then there's slightly later histories as well, that like Cassius Dio, that provide some important historical evidence. There's actually not the annalistic or chronicle evidence for the later 2nd century. It's a little bit weird, but still the evidence for the Antonine Plague is pretty good. But yeah, the inscriptions are really amazing, and so there's 3 or 4 different kinds of inscriptions that I think are really important for understanding the Antonine Plague. One is something that my mentor in graduate school, Christopher Jones, is really the person who put this together. But we have a large number of inscriptions that people put sort of over their doorway that is a dedication to the gods and goddesses that is almost certainly connected to a command of the Oracle of Apollo. And so we have a lot of inscriptions that are connected to a kind of response that's emanating from the temples of Apollo, who's the god that they think causes this plague. And he pieced that together brilliantly. Then there's 6 or 7 other longer inscriptions that very specifically say, everybody's dying of plague, so we sent an embassy to the Oracle of Apollo, and here's what he told us to do. And it's mostly sacrifice a bunch of animals to Apollo, although in one case, it's actually ritual lustrations of the city and a kind of fumigation of the city, which maybe was meant to drive off the kind of poisonous air or miasma that they thought was causing the plague. So these inscriptions of Apollo are very important. There's a little pewter amulet in London that's almost, I think, certainly connected to the Antonine Plague. That's again reflective of Apollo, an oracle of Apollo, in which he tells people not to kiss. and in the middle of what may have been a smallpox pandemic in a society where kissing was a common form of greeting and kissing on the lips, this was probably pretty good advice. So there's a little social distancing for you. Just like I think we're never going to go back to handshakes. I can't imagine I'm going to be fist bumping or elbow bumping people for years. Who knows? Maybe this is when they stop kissing each other on the lips. But it's a little inscription on a pewter amulet. So then there are actually some other inscriptions related to the Roman army that are circumstantial. There's a large number of burial inscriptions from a couple of regions in precisely the right period, the late 160s. So the epigraphic evidence for the Antonine Plague is very important.
Great. I'm going to turn the questions now overseas. We have a couple graduate students at least listening from the University of Sheffield. And here is a question from Emma, graduate student in human osteoarchaeology and funerary studies, I believe. I'm interested in leprosy. As this disease was in Europe during the Roman period, what kept it from exploding there as it did during the Middle Ages?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I hope she's writing a dissertation that'll provide us very good answers on this, because leprosy seems to have been perceived as a new disease, and I think that's what both Pliny the Elder and, oh gosh, I'm reaching back in my memory now. It may be is it Plutarch who's talking about leprosy as a new disease? I apologize, I can't recall, but there is a sense that leprosy is introduced into the Roman Empire, and I have not seen as much bioarchaeological work on leprosy. There's some, as there have been on other diseases like tuberculosis and malaria in the Roman Empire, and leprosies would have thrived in the ecological conditions of the classical cities. So I'm not so sure that it wasn't fairly widespread. I think that's a question well worth exploring, and I hope that Emma's writing a dissertation that'll help us get at that question.
Yeah, terrific. Here's a question from Molly. I'll read this out as well. I'm thinking a lot about anxiety at the individual, societal, and environmental levels. What evidence exists for Roman experiences of and expressions of anxiety about disease and death?
Boy, yeah, what a tough question, and obviously a very relevant one. I do think that, again, as a historian, sometimes what can be helpful is to see the differences. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic is so different than past experiences because of the sort of nature of media. This is the first social media pandemic in history, and the world is kind of experiencing it in this weird, isolated but connected way. And I think it's very, it's a source of really deep anxiety for people, and it's psychologically very difficult. It's going to have very difficult effects. So I think that's a kind of a contrast with many of these ancient experiences where they didn't necessarily know what was happening a few towns over, and that doesn't mean it was any less traumatic. It just means that the kind of media in which people psychologically experience disease events was so different. And I think it's really hard for us to get at that kind of psychological questions. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try or look at our written sources through those lenses. And I think we can somewhat get at ways that they thought about death and the kind of cultural frameworks in which they process these events. I do think that most of the evidence for the pandemics that I study, whether it's the Antonine Plague, the Plague of Cyprian, or the Justinianic Plague, that the cultural framework within which they experience this psychologically is religious. These are, we live in a more secular society, and we have germ theory. Even if you're a religious person, you have the mental framework of evolution and infectious disease biology that provides a way of explaining the mechanics of a disease event. When we are thinking about these ancient societies, whether pagan or Christian, by the 6th century, they don't have germ theory, and most people don't have a kind of mechanistic way of explaining this. That's not to say there isn't science. There is ancient medicine, ancient science, and Galen has a way of explaining epidemics. But I think most people don't think of the pestilence in the way that a Galen does. They think of it in terms of, why are the gods angry? And I think that this can manifest itself in, for instance, persecution. We don't necessarily know that the persecutions of the Christians in the 160s and the 250s are directly related to the plagues, but coincident periods of mortality that's hard for them to process and explain. So it's a hard question, but I think the way to get at it is to try and understand the cultural frameworks through which they see these diseases. And in the case of the Justinianic plague, which was probably the worst of these events by far, just in terms of the biological impact and demographic impact, I think that is a predominantly Christian society, and we do see religious responses. We see rituals develop that are meant to try and implore God's mercy. We see apocalyptic thinking. People perceive this as a kind of sign that the end times are coming. So you can kind of get at some of the ways in which people perceive and process these events.
Great. We're coming up towards the end. Do you have energy, Kyle, for a couple more?
Of course, please.
So I'm going to bundle this next question. A few listeners have been interested in the environment, which is something we talked about in terms of ecology. Don, and a Davidson alum, is asking about the environmental poisoning, to what degree pollution, environmental poisoning made an impact on health in Rome. Some scholars, he says, have thought that lead from southern England may have contributed to the fall of the Roman Empire. Along the same line, Robin, graduate student from the University of Sheffield, is also asking about any patterns in social environments, climate, et cetera, that correspond to outbreak, and is an awareness of something like that. Does that allow us perhaps to predict outbreaks? So in general, what role does the environment play?
Yeah. Well, let me handle the first question more briefly than it might deserve, because it's an interesting one, and I would be very skeptical of anything that draws a line of connection between lead poisoning and kind of dramatic social and political events. But we're now increasingly able with chemical analysis to look for traces of lead poisoning, and I think there's increasingly evidence that this would have been a health issue in Roman society, and it would have contributed to weakening physical and cognitive development in many of the built environments of the Romans. So there was high lead content in many of their built environments that we now can see was probably at a level that was dangerous to their health. So it's not an infectious disease issue, but it's still just an interesting human biology and human health issue that we're able to get at through better more archaeological evidence and better analytical tools. The other question, or side of this question, relating the physical climate to the health environment, is a huge one, and it's one of those that's it's just a vast question, and the answer to a certain extent is definitely yes, that there are interconnections between the physical climate and the biological environment, and there are connections between change and variability in the physical climate and the incidence of epidemic mortality, but they're very complex. And in the instance of the first millennium, so the Roman period, is usually beyond our ability to draw very strong connections. There are different mechanisms through which changes in the physical climate can affect infectious diseases. One is that, for instance, crop failure and famine can cause food shortages, that make human beings more susceptible to infection. So famine and pestilence often went hand in hand. Two is that climate variability can strongly affect the vectors of infectious diseases. So think particularly of mosquitoes, that in a place like Italy, are the important as vectors of malaria. Mosquito reproduction can be varies from year to year, and it's controlled by the climate in very complex ways. So like it's a dry spring and a wet summer is usually associated with a spike in malaria in historical times. So that's a different mechanism. So human susceptibility because of malnutrition, vector reproduction is another. The example that I know I'm going to bring up is the 6th century, which is a really interesting one, because we now know that in the years immediately leading up to the outbreak of the Justinianic plague, there's one of the biggest climate anomalies of the last 3,000 years. There's a significant northern hemispheric volcanic eruption in 536 that a number of contemporary sources tell us hid the sun, veiled the sun for over a year. So it was a big enough climate volcanic event that people really noticed it. And then 4 years later, there's a tropical eruption. It was a massive volcanic eruption, one of the biggest of the late Holocene, bigger than Tambora in 1815, which had huge environmental and then knock-on effects. So you have these two meaningful volcanic eruptions right in a row, right before the Justinianic plague shows up. And yet we don't know if there's a relationship. It sort of seems like there ought to be, because you have maybe the biggest kind of decadal scale climate anomaly of the last 2,500 years. You have maybe the biggest biological event in Western Eurasia in the first millennium, I would argue. There's a flash, there's a bang. Usually you think there's a connection between them. We don't know what it is. Were people hungry and susceptible to disease that caused or worsened the Justinianic plague? Maybe. I think there's a possibility that the climate event had an influence on the rodent reservoirs or carriers of the disease. Plague is a rodent disease. Rodent populations are very sensitively influenced by climate. And so did it trigger the spillover event? But at this point, we're kind of speculating about mechanisms. And I haven't seen anything that really I find totally convincing. I think I've tried to speculate a little too, but it's an open question right now. So there are connections between climate and disease. They're very hard, they're very complex mechanistically. It makes it very hard to predict. Sometimes you probably have climate events that don't cause epidemic mortality in the past. And so, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Kyle, thank you very much. This has been terrific. We have an interesting final question that might be a good closing question for our listeners. And that is coming from a sophomore at Davidson College, Anna, and she's wondering how you became interested in this topic and why become a historian of disease. So why don't we close out on that?
All right. Well, I mentioned a little bit at the beginning, I was always fortunate in the teachers that I had, and they're great mentors who always encouraged to work at the frontiers of disciplines. And I think, Anna, if you're a student, I would strongly encourage you to try and work at the frontiers of different fields of knowledge. It's where a lot of the exciting things can happen. But I always loved biology, and I think if I hadn't been a historian, I might have been a biologist. And as you get older and you have tenure and you only live once, I'm not going to go back and get a PhD in biology, but that isn't going to stop me from writing about a historical question where I get to read biology and collaborate with biologists and talk to people who do biology. I just find genetics and microbiology totally fascinating. I find infectious disease biology completely fascinating. And I think it's important as an economist or economic historian to think about the relationship between biology and economic history. And then I'll give just one last example. I remember before I got into any of this, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, before I started writing about infectious diseases, I was at a conference and I asked a medical historian, if I twisted your arm, what do you think most people in the Roman Empire died of? And he said, diarrhea. And I remember I'd studied, I'd gone to graduate school, worked so hard to study the Roman Empire. I would have never said that. And I think he's right. I think that was probably the number one cause of death was diarrhea, and particularly infantile diarrhea. And I remember being so captivated by that and feeling like I didn't know people I studied. And just the disjuncture between this amazingly big and powerful empire. I think that the number one cause of death is diarrhea. And just I don't know, something about that. I wanted to really try and understand that, and I've just found those kinds of questions fascinating.
Great. Well, Kyle, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing all of these thoughts. It was really rich and just so much to think about. So thank you. Thank you to all people who tuned in, parents, students, alums, community members, faculty, colleagues, everyone. This has been a terrific event. I would like to remind you all and invite everyone back next Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, when my colleague, Dr. Ilana McQuinn from the Department of History at Davidson College will welcome Dr. Sunny Yutkov, Assistant Professor of German at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who will be discussing how experiences with tuberculosis have shaped Jewish literature. That's next Wednesday, 7 p.m. All right, have a great night or good morning, wherever you are.
Thank you all. Thank you all.